This is Lou Lentini. This is a narration of the Via Dolorosa, the historical account of the murder of the Son of God. New precise information has been obtained concerning the shroud and the death of Jesus. An EWTN 2007 DVD titled The Star of Bethlehem, a computer program researched from mathematical laws, was developed from Kepler's laws in the 17th century and is used today by NASA and every space agency around the world. Here are a few examples. New Horizons was launched in 2006 and took 9 years to reach Pluto, 3 billion miles from Earth. Voyager 2 was launched in 1977 to visit Uranus, which is 1.8 billion miles from Earth, and continued to pass Neptune, which is 2.8 billion miles away, and took 12 years. It is currently 11 billion miles from Earth and still communicates with mission control operators. Kepler's laws allow precise determination of exactly where and when a planet will be many years into the future. The program is BethlehemStar.com. The star, which stopped over Bethlehem, was actually comprised of Jupiter, the king planet, Regulus, the king star, and Venus. Regulus is the brightest star in the constellation Leo, the lion. They were an astrological retrograde. Retrograde means that it's in an elliptical turn, and when it reaches the top of that apex, the turn, it appears to be stopped because it's still continuing as it goes around. That's why those 3 planets are so bright, and it looked like a star had stopped over Bethlehem. The Shroud of Turin is kept in a bulletproof container maintained in John the Baptist Cathedral in Turin, Italy. Most of my research on the shroud was taken from a book by Dr. Pierre Barbet, written in 1953. It began from an exposition of the Shroud of Turin in 1933. It's entitled A Doctor at Calvary. Of course, it's currently out of print, but it still can be obtained in bookstores or online. I have also used a factual review of the shroud from Dr. Robert Spitzer's 2018 presentation. Carbon dating was performed on the shroud in 1978 and again in 1988. It was determined that the samples sent to the 3 different labs were taken from a piece of cotton patch made by medieval nuns after the fire damage in 1532 AD, and the area where the hem was displayed and held. So the hem was contaminated. Samples were not cut from the actual linen cloth. The blood type has been identified as AB positive. It has now been determined that the image on the shroud was made by a very bright light of 6 to 8 billion watts and lasted for 1/40th of a billionth of a second. Pretty short. The image is in 3D, photographed during the 1970s. Microchemical analysis has revealed no pigments, stains, powders, dyes, or painting media on the shroud. Analysis has shown pollen that is known in France and only in Israel and Odessa in the Middle East, and only blooms during spring in Israel. The first station, Jesus is condemned to death. Jesus was raised in Nazareth, an obscure town in what is now the Middle East, basically a backwater kind of town. He was about 33 years of age. I say about because he was born in September 3 BC. The Magi, however many they were, visited Jesus on December 25th, 2 BC, in Mary and Joseph's home. Obviously, they would have been out of that stable or cave. Jesus was a toddler under 2 years of age. Tiberius was the emperor. Herod, who directed the slaughter of the innocents, died in 1 BC. Pontius Pilate was the prefect or governor of Imperial Rome in Palestine. Historian Josephus states that he died 6 years after Jesus' death. Eusebius, historian and bishop of Caesarea, says Pilate committed suicide around 36 AD. Jesus was betrayed by Judas Iscariot, Iscariot meaning Kerioth, from a village in Judea, and he was the only non-Galilean among the 12 disciples. He hung himself after he could not save Jesus from the religious authorities. Jesus did not fulfill Judas's quest from Roman occupation. Like all of us, he could have been forgiven if he had just asked Jesus. Under Roman occupation, Jews were only allowed certain types of death, particularly stoning, which was punishable for blaspheming. Of the three, Jesus alone was scourged. The two criminals were not. We call them thieves, insurrectionists, terrorists. They weren't just thieves. History claims most crucifixions were preceded by scourging. The intent was to weaken the crucified person, to make him suffer for about 3 to 4 days. Except under very specific circumstances, a Roman citizen could not be crucified. Like St. Paul, he was beheaded. The Pharisees limited a scourging to 40 lashes, but they went to 39 so as not to go over the Hebrew law limit, which we understand was also a way of them showing a little mercy. But the Romans had no such rule, just that the criminal must be able to die on the cross, just as was sentenced by Pilate. The Shroud of Turin indicates 100 and 120 blows with the Roman flagrum. Try if you can to picture Jesus before Pilate. He had sweat blood in the Garden of Gethsemane. Not sweat like blood, but he shed blood mixed with sweat. This is called hematidrosis. Forget the sterile pictures we see of Jesus in colorful garments, in the prayerful pose with his hands pressed together. Leonardo da Vinci even wrote about a soldier who had bloody sweat before a battle. It has been shown that the body, under severe stress, will sweat blood as capillaries burst under the pressure and then mix with the sweat to fall to the ground. Jesus was a picture of pain and blood. Certainly not a pretty picture. He had now been beaten by the Roman guards and then scourged. Jesus was scourged by 2 executioners of different heights. one on each side of Jesus. He was scourged naked, tied to an upright cross with his hands above his head. The second station, Jesus takes up his cross. Jesus did not carry the full cross as depicted in classic religious art. The patibulum was the crosspiece. The upright, the stripes crucis, was permanently placed in the ground. Just picture a mortise and tenon joint used in the construction of furniture. A very common and very secure joint. The criminal carried the patibulum on his right shoulder. The left hand is also tied to the left ankle. His hands would also have been tied to rings at either side of the patibulum. This prevented the criminal from throwing down the beam and escaping. The beam alone weighed about 90 pounds. The total weight of the cross would have averaged about 275 pounds and was 9 feet tall. Jesus was 5'10" and weighed about 175 pounds. He may have carried a sign called the titulus around his neck, or was fashioned to a staff carried by the centurion. It was written in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek, stating his name and his crime: Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. The condemned were usually forced to walk to their crucifixion naked, but the Romans did not force this practice on this occupied populace. The road to Golgotha was estimated to be a third of a mile. The procession was preceded by a trumpeter announcing the names of the criminals. The current Via Dolorosa walk is actually 12 to 13 feet above the actual roadway where Jesus did walk. Because when an invading army conquered a city, they leveled it and then built their own structures on top of that debris. And Israel was conquered many times. Jerusalem, actually, too. Third station, Jesus falls the first time. Exhausted, in shock, dehydrated, and cold, Jesus succumbs to the weight of the patibulum and falls. The weight pins him to the rough road. The lacerations on his right knee are very evident on the shroud. Jesus is right-handed. The weight of the patibulum caused him to fall on his right knee. Fourth station, Jesus meets his mother. At his presentation in the temple, Simeon prophesied that a sword would pierce Mary's own soul. I cannot imagine such a meeting. His mother, who protected and cared for him his whole life, now could do nothing to comfort him. Mary was there, watching and waiting for the moment when she could get close to her son. Fifth station, Simon helps Jesus carry his cross. Simon of Cyrene was in Jerusalem with his two sons, Alexander and Rufus, to celebrate the Passover. Cyrene was a Greek city in North Africa. Sixth station, Veronica wipes the face of Jesus. Veronica was a very courageous woman to step out of the crowd, take off her veil, and wipe the face of Jesus. Although only in tradition, it is widely accepted by the Catholic Church and is visible in Vatican paintings. It appears to be like the facial image of Jesus from the Shroud of Turin. Her veil is kept in the Vatican archives. The name Veronica is taken from vera, meaning true, and icon, meaning likeness. Seventh station, Jesus falls the second time. Once again, even with the help of Simon, Jesus succumbs to his incredible ordeal and falls the second time. Each time, the Roman guard whips him, demanding that he continue. Get up and walk. They don't have all day. This is just a job. 8th station, Jesus meets the women of Jerusalem. Jesus calls them the daughters of Jerusalem and prophesied to them as told in the Gospel of Luke. Again, the whip descends and the march to Golgotha continues. 9th station, Jesus falls the 3rd time. Exhaustion, thirst, and shock take hold again, but the end is in sight. It's just ahead. 10th station, Jesus is stripped of his garments. Simon is relieved of his part and goes back to find his sons, Alexander and Rufus. His conscription results in his conversion to Christianity, along with his family. The book of Romans mentions Rufus by name. Out of our sense of dignity and respect, we show a crucified Jesus with a drape over his body. However, the purpose of the Roman crucifixion was to cause the victim total pain, total humiliation, and ultimately death. There is a cathedral in Barcelona, Spain called La Sagrada Familia, under construction for the past 138 years. Is due for completion by 2027. It is immense. Carol and I were there in 2014. Among its many statues, it has life-size statues of the Stations of the Cross. It is the only example I know of depicting a naked Jesus on the cross. We do have a tendency also to sterilize everything. 11th station, Jesus nailed to the cross. Jesus was nailed to the patibulum through the wrists. The Greek word for hand is the area from the fingers to the elbow. Romans also consider the wrist with the fingers as the hand. A nail through the palm would tear out under only 40 pounds of weight. The nail was fitted in the area between the wrist bones and where the median nerve passes, securing the arm, but not breaking any bone. Mystics such as St. Francis of Assisi, St. Teresa Newman, St. Padre Pio had stigmata in their hands. St. Teresa was questioned about this and stated that the stigmata had only a mystical meaning as to their location on the palms. Piercing the median nerve locks the thumb across the palm and is incredibly painful. Ever hit your funny bone or suffer from carpal tunnel? The Shroud of Turin does not show Jesus' thumbs, and for good reason. The victim was nailed or tied to the beam. Jesus was nailed, probably because they did not intend to have him hanging alive for the usual 3 to 4 days. The nails were iron, about 6 to maybe 7 inches long. There was not a board to form a seat or one to support his feet. The patibulum is fixed on the stripus crucis at the top in a mortise and tenon joint forming the Roman T. The victim was hung with his head about 18 inches above an observer's head. This allowed passerby to spit on the victim and easily mock him. which is verified in the Gospels. The T also allowed 2 soldiers to lift the victim, whose hands had been nailed to the ends of the patibulum, onto this tenon joint. Again, this is the Roman Tau cross. The Stripus Cursus was above the ground, 6 feet 8 inches. Once installed, the feet were then nailed to the crucis, left over right through the ankles. Ladders were not used as depicted in the paintings. Talk about dramatic. The Romans didn't have time for that. This was a job, they had to do it, period. In fact, during the 3-year siege by Rome, from 67 AD to 70 AD, the Romans crucified over 500 people a day. Remember the movie Spartacus? Hollywood certainly used poetic license. Bring a box of tissues. Kirk Douglas was spectacular and best known in his entire career for the movie Spartacus. After their revolt, the Romans crucified about 6,000 along the road from Capua to Rome. Crucifixion was nothing special to the Roman army, and it had to be efficient. They were paid to do a job, and it was a common event. Except for these 3, crucifixions were held off during the annual celebration of Passover. Crucifixion was actually started by Persia, which is currently Iran, and first recorded in the 7th century BC. It was practiced then by the Greeks, the Carthaginians, the Macedonians, and then perfected by the Romans. The practice was stopped by Constantine in 337 AD. Crucifixions were held outside the walls of Jerusalem. Golgotha is now inside the city walls. Jesus was crucified between 2 men convicted of capital offenses. This was also prophesied by Isaiah over 600 years before Christ. The 12th station, Jesus dies on the cross. 6 hours on the cross, 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. St. Mark is the only one to mention the 9 a.m. time slot. Very difficult, with very little recorded conversation, because talking under these circumstances was extremely difficult. Only 7 phrases are recorded by St. John, because he was there. Jesus died of asphyxia. The physical suffering he endured during his passion is simply beyond comprehension, but it pales in comparison to the terrible agony his soul suffered when he took our sins on himself and experienced his Father's rejection. My God, why have you forsaken me? The first line of Psalm 22, which was memorized by Jews, and Jesus, of course. It is believed that only the first line was spoken by Jesus to remind the hearers of the full text of the psalm, which they had always memorized. Jesus died at the 6th hour, 3 p.m., on April 3rd, 33 AD. This is verified in the DVD, The Star of Bethlehem. Jesus died on Preparation Day, the day before the Passover. And this was a special Passover. This Passover took place at twilight on the 14th day of the first month in the Jewish lunar calendar. The month was Nisan, a blood moon had to also occur as prophesied by the prophet Joel. 3 p.m., exactly when the last sacrificial lamb was sacrificed in the temple. The inner veil in the Herodian temple separated the holy place from the Holy of Holies. It was torn from top to bottom, was about 4 inches thick, and was 45 to 60 feet tall and 30 feet wide. 13th station. Jesus is taken down from the cross. Once again, efficiency rules. The nails were not bent over as depicted in The Passion of Christ by Mel Gibson. Since they were iron, once they would have been straightened, they would break, therefore limiting their usefulness. They lowered the patibulum with his body and pulled out the nails. If not claimed by the family, common criminals were tossed into a heap on the garbage dump, which was always burning. If you hadn't seen the movie Risen, I strongly recommend it. I have seen it a little over 6 times. Jesus' body was then given to his mother. Saints John and Mary Magdalene, Nicodemus, and Joseph of Arimathea were at the cross. They were the 2 members of the Sanhedrin, which were believers. Jesus had given the care of his mother to St. John while on the cross. Another testimony that Jesus was Mary's only child. It was Jewish law that a widowed mother must be placed in the care of a son, not a friend. 14th station. Jesus is placed in the tomb. Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the Sanhedrin and secret follower of Jesus, offered his new garden tomb for Jesus. It was carved out of solid limestone and had a round stone that would be rolled over the entrance to seal it. The stone would have weighed between 1,000 and 4,000 pounds. Remember, you cannot have an Easter Sunday without a Good Friday. And every Good Friday has an Easter Sunday. 2 points. The shroud was damaged by fire in 1532. When Jesus was placed in the tomb, coins were placed over his eyes. These were Pilate minted coins between 29 and 32 AD. And Jesus was in rigor mortis in the tomb, with his left foot bent, arched, the way he was crucified, and the imprint is on the shroud. There is so much more to learn concerning the shroud, so conduct your own study and make the shroud personal. Thank you.